back to the Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio. For those newly joining the program, my name is Irina Zuckerman, and I'm the editor-in-chief of the Washington Outsider. With us today is Clare Lopez. She is a former CIA officer, and she's the founder and president of the Liberty United West. She's also a veteran analyst for think tanks. We are here with her, to discuss with her some developments pertaining to the Middle East, or rather, specifically, the results of the BBC investigation, which found that in addition to the Hamas attack on Israel on October 7th, at least 4 other organizations joined forces with it, including the Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigade, which is affiliated with Fatah, a rival organization. We will also discuss the information warfare that keeps this union together, but at the same time keeps the attention away from this growing alliance. And we will talk about how these organizations relate to outside actors and partnerships, and not just Iran and Muslim Brotherhood, but also other entities who have assisted in various ways before and since. Thank you so much for joining us, Clare. Before we get into the meat of the discussion, could you tell us a little bit about yourself, your experiences, and your current work in your organization?
Right. Thank you, Irina. Very glad to be with you. So, although the first focus of my professional career was Russia, Soviet Union and Russia, it was after 9/11 attention to the Middle East. And being in Washington, D.C., or nearby Washington, D.C., I had the great good fortune to have access to many experts, think tanks and experts, all kinds of luncheon speaker programs and conferences and so forth. And that's where I really got to learn about the Middle East, and did a deep dive study of Islam, the Islamic doctrine, law, scripture, history, and made a particular focus of Iran, which is to this day one of my major focuses, or focuses, when I'm looking at the Middle East. So certainly right now, and since the Shabbat massacre of October 7, 2023 this year, I've been very much focused on Israel, Hamas, also Hezbollah, and of course Iran, and the Islamic Jihad doctrine that drives all of this. So that's been my focus now. It's hard to believe it's already been 2 months, practically 2 months now, since that attack.
Indeed, time flies whether you are having fun or not. But that brings me to this point, namely, while Hamas is certainly an Islamist organization and was very much deliberately created as such, not every Palestinian group was originally touted specifically as Islamist or even religion-oriented. The Soviet-backed PLO back in the day, for instance, was very much a secular nationalist, pan-Arabist liberation movement-oriented endeavor. Yet today, despite staunch rivalry between these Islamist and these pan-Arabist nationalist secular groups, we are seeing that they're joining forces against Israel. Why is that the case? What brings them together? Do they really see any hope of defeating Israel militarily? Is that their aspiration, or is something else driving them?
No, I don't think it's that. They don't necessarily think they can defeat Israel militarily. The IDF is a powerful military force. But I would have to say this very much is absolutely 100% an Islamic jihad operation. And of course, it goes back to the time of Muhammad in the Quran, when he obliterated the 3 main, very large and prosperous Jewish tribes at the time of the 7th century on what would become the Arabian Peninsula, the Banu Nadir, the Banu Kanuka, and the Banu Qurayza,
If I
obliterated them, wiped them out, and then, of course, left behind the saying, there shall not be two religions on this peninsula.
My
And everything
understanding was,
since then.
just sorry to interrupt, my understanding of the events was that it did not in fact start out as a religious battle. The
Oh,
actual
yes, it absolutely is. No
much
question.
of the jihad did come later by Muhammad's followers, but at the time there was political rivalry among some of those groups who sided with Muhammad's other
No, very,
level.
very specifically, we are told in the Quran, the Hadiths, the Sirah, that is the biography of
Mhm.
Muhammad, as well as other sources, the tafsirs, for example, that the reason that Muhammad wiped out the Jewish tribes on the peninsula was precisely because they did not want to convert to Islam. That
But
is no question about that. That's the beginning of the enmity and the hatred, Jew hatred, of course, being doctrinal to Islam. It is something that every faithful Muslim, and I would never call them Islamists. You're either a faithful, devout, obedient Muslim or you're not.
but
But
what
it is doctrinal that a faithful Muslim must adhere to the doctrine of Jew hatred. That's intrinsic to Islam.
But what can be said of the fact that Muhammad actually did have Jewish friends, and of the fact that a lot of these Jewish tribes actually remained in Arabia, in the Arabian Peninsula, and continued living there. Eventually, many of them converted to Christianity, and some of them directly to Islam or Christianity and then Islam. But a lot of them remained in place, and those sources have been deliberately obfuscated over time, including by some of the zealots who wished that view to be seen. I mean, there are sources directly pointing to Muhammad actually being friends with Jews up to the end of his own death. So clearly,
No. The enmity between Islam and Jews, Judaism, is well documented. It is from the start. It's from the beginning, and of course, as we saw then, if Muhammad ever actually lived, there's no actual evidence, concrete archaeological or any other kind of evidence that he existed. But let's say that he did. When the armies of Islam did burst out of the peninsula, the targets were specifically in the region. They were the Jews and also the Christians. And the reason they were the targets is because they refused to convert to Islam. And there were so many of them, actually, after a point in time, that a third choice beyond convert or die had to be offered. And that third choice brings us to the situation of the current day. That third choice was that those conquered people, the Christians and the Jews, could remain Christians and Jews, but as according to the Quran and also the books of law of Islam, they would have to be called the Ahle Dhimma, the people who were dhimmi people, which means subjugated people. And this comes from verse 929 of the Quran, of course, which says that they must be fought and killed, even if they be people of the book, until they pay the jizya, the annual blood tax, to remain alive, pay the jizya with willing submission and feel themselves subdued. And that brings us to the current day and why we see Islamic Jihad terror organizations like Hamas, like Hezbollah, like the Houthis, like the Hashd-e-Shaabi in Iraq, be they Shiite or Sunni, doesn't matter as much as the fact that they are unified in fighting against the Jewish state of Israel. Why? Number one, because the Jewish people are not dhimmis anymore. They are not second-class citizens to anyone. But the second reason has to do with another bit of doctrine. And that doctrine is called sacred space. And what it means is that any land ever occupied or conquered by Islam is forever held to be waqf, W-A-Q-F, waqf, which means land endowed by God, by Allah, to Islam, to the Muslims in perpetuity. And if they lose that land one way or another over time and history, they must fight forever to get it back. That is why the forces of Islamic Jihad feel and believe that it is necessary, it is doctrinally obligatory for them to wipe out the Jewish people and destroy the Jewish state of Israel.
But that leads to many questions. First of all, if Muhammad did not actually exist as a single person, if there was more than one source of the origin of religion, and if there's no documentation of the exact circumstances his existence, then who and what exactly are all these people following, and why are they so adamant that these events happened exactly as portrayed? If there's, let me put it this way, if there's no evidence that the person is then existed, then the entire basis for the belief about enmity between Jews and Islam comes into question.
Well,
And
whether he existed or not, or was a composite figure, just as you suggest, perhaps, the point is that the doctrine did develop. The doctrine that has come down through these 1400 or so years since the beginning of Islam back in the 7th century. The doctrine has been shaped and formed and developed, and it is taught now in madrasas across the entire world, including right here in the United States. They're taught in the great universities. There are courts of law which adjudicate Islamic law or Sharia all over the world, including right here in the United States. So the doctrine, the law, and the scripture have developed and grown up over the centuries, whether Muhammad himself as an individual person ever existed or not.
So the question is this. We've seen throughout history periods of dimitude where Jews did reside in Muslim-held lands, as they had to pay taxes.
Well, they were Jewish lands, but they've been conquered by Islam. They were Jewish lands.
No, I'm not talking about Israel. I'm talking about places like Spain, like Turkey, like modern-day Turkey, the Ottoman Empire, Andalusia, and so forth.
Yes, that used to be Christian.
Exactly. Not Jewish, but lands that were under Muslim control. They lived there and they existed. You may argue about the quality of their existence. They weren't, at the time, they weren't particularly treated all that great in Christianity, and things waxed and waned. But now we're seeing that both Fatah-controlled territories, the Palestinian Authority-controlled territories, and Gaza Strip are completely free of Jews. So if the doctrine of Islam allows for this third option of Jews either being accepted as converts or being allowed to live and pay the secondary tax, why do we see this complete dedication to annihilation of any Jewish presence, whether in Gaza or anywhere else? Because it seems to be in conflict with the actual history of religion, no matter how you see it.
Well, we may be looking at this perhaps from a Western point of view, a Judeo-Christian Western-based point of view, and the reason that it's difficult, of course, it's difficult for people of our civilization, of actual civilization, to understand, to get our heads wrapped around how they think, is precisely because we have grown up in a Judeo-Christian based society of the West. Now, the reason that the devout, I'm talking about devout and faithful and obedient Muslims. Now there are many Muslims. There's only one Islam, but there are many Muslims, and Muslims deserve to be treated as individuals. And if they have different ways of looking at things as individuals, that needs to be respected. But the reason that devout and faithful and obedient Muslims remain in such horrific opposition, hate-filled, Jew-hated, opposition, to the Jewish people comes from the Quran. And of course, the Quran is believed to be the literal word of God, of Allah. And so you have verses like, fight them until religion is all for Allah, or infidels are the most vile of human beings. These things are taught to children in madrasas from knee high to their mother's knee. They're taught all through the educational system, and certainly in Gaza. Certainly, unfortunately, there in UNRWA schools, United Nations Relief and Works Agency schools, that are now being found to hold not just, books and training and teaching about Jew hatred, but missiles and rockets and mortars as well in the schools. So this is where it comes from. But the original source and why it remains holding a grip on the most devout and faithful and obedient of Muslims is because it's in the Quran. That's the final source, the most authoritative source, and that's where it comes from.
But what is it that caused Hamas, etc., and its entire network to embrace not simply the original source, not simply the interpretation adhered to throughout history, where in most cases Jews did not end up being completely wiped out. They certainly suffered massacres, they certainly suffered from anti-Semitism, and they certainly did not always have good relations from the neighbors and lived as second-class citizens. But what is it that caused Hamas to look for outright genocide, to go back not just to the history of the entire Islamic world for the past, hundreds and years, going back to that period of time, but to the very beginnings, at the peak of that sort of warfare, where that sort of complete annihilation was acceptable? Why is it they're going back to the very rudiments of that and not some other period in time?
I think the answer to that lies in the definition, the history, the formation of Hamas itself. Now, Hamas, of course, is an acronym from the Arabic Harakat al-Muqawama al-Islamiyya, which means the Islamic resistance movement. It's not the Palestinian resistance movement. It's not the Hamas resistance. It's the Islamic resistance movement. And Hamas was formally established in 1988. It was formed by Sheikh Ahmed Yassin, himself a Muslim brother. And Hamas itself is the Gaza branch of the original Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood, which is a jihadist organization dedicated to the reestablishment of the caliphate around the world, and dedication to Allah, to Muhammad, to the Quran, and to jihad, according to its own motto. Now, when you look at the Hamas covenant, which was published at its founding in 1988, you'll see in the very opening lines of that covenant that it says, Israel exists and will continue to exist until Islam will obliterate it as it has obliterated others before it, quote unquote. That's where that comes from.
So now we are faced with the fact that while Hamas has certainly taken the lead on this particular operation and everything that followed, it was also surrounded by allies that weren't necessarily that claimed to be motivated by national struggle, but apparently the entire time were.
You mean like countries like Egypt and Jordan? Is that what you mean?
No. I'm talking about PLO-like entities like Al-Aqsa brigades and yes,
okay.
that did not specifically define them on religious grounds, but define them on political, nationalist.
Well, actually, Arafat defines it very much so on Islamic doctrinal grounds. He was trained, taught, steeped in the doctrine, the law, and the scripture of Islam. He very much, you can call the PLO a political organization, but it's an Islamic jihad organization at its roots.
This is very interesting point that is often overlooked. And that's precisely why I wanted to bring it up, because when the Soviet Union embraced groups like this, uh, everyone seemed to have believed that all of these groups automatically became socialist in their entirety and abandoned their original identity, just because they were backed by the Soviet Union. That appears to not be the case. Muslim Brotherhood was influenced by socialist revolutionary ideology, by Bolsheviks and by Nazis, but they certainly did not abandon the Islamist roots, and neither did the PLO. So we ended up having a deadly combination, with the Soviets simply backing an organization that existed at the time. Hamas was not yet created. Hamas was brought in opposition to PLO as the legitimate Islamist heir, but
You
clearly,
mean Islamic, right? You mean Islamic,
yes.
not Islamist, right?
Well,
Islamic.
that's it was at the time of Cold War. That is certainly was the main view of Islam, for sure.
Right.
That's for
So,
sure.
yeah,
But my question is as follows: both of them have roots in the same basic ideas. It's just that the Soviet Union was backing one, yet Hamas was being sold as the legitimate religious entity. How can
right.
that succeed?
No, there's no contradiction here. Um, when when Yasser Arafat
Hmm.
first founded Fatah, which was in 1958, and then later in 1964 founded the PLO, he very much was in collaboration with the Soviet Union, with the KGB. Yevgeny Primakov, at that time, originally was the foreign minister of the Soviet Union and later became the head of the KGB. And they worked very closely together. And the reason for that is that both of these ideologies, communism, Marxism, on the one hand, you might say, and Islam on the other, are totalitarian, authoritative, dominating ideologies which resent and want to destroy any competition, in particular Judeo-Christianity, because those have a completely different moral and ethical foundation of you know um, the way that humans should behave and live their lives. It's completely different than both communism, Marxism, and Islam. And so there was a natural alliance here, even though you can say very certainly the two are different. We call this the red-green axis. Red for communism, Marxism, green for Islam. They are both joined because they wish to do away with all the foundational principles, the Judeo-Christian principles of Western civilization. They find commonality in that objective, which means the West, Western Europe, Eastern Europe, it means the United States, and certainly means Israel. And so in that, they find common purpose, and that's how they came together and remain together even to this day, in terms of what, again, we call the red-green axis. We can see it here in the United States, for example, with the de facto alliance in the streets of a Marxist communist organization like Antifa, or the Black Lives Matter movement, which of course was founded by 3 Marxist women. And they're combining, with the cause as they see it, of Hamas, which is horrific and appalling to consider. But when you understand that each of these ideologies is based and grounded in a belief that they, a small elite, should
Hmm.
conquer and control all of society. They are authoritative. They are tyrannical. There's no such thing as government by consent of the governed. And they rule by terror. They stay in power only by terror. So you can see how the two come together and can find common cause, even though the ideologies are different. maybe someday they'll settle up. We'll see
But
one day. But
here's
for the moment, they're like this.
but here's the question. What you're telling me, and it seems to be make complete sense, is that Fatah and PLO and Hamas are not all that different at their core.
Are what again?
They're not all that different. They're much more similar than they're different because they're all inspired by it. So then how was Hamas, how were the leaders of Hamas able to sell Hamas as a counterpoint to Fatah as more legitimate?
It's not a counterpoint.
But
they're
how
allied.
Uh-huh.
They're not a counterpoint. That's the point.
But
they are not in opposition. They are
So
totally
they
in
never
alliance.
So the power struggle between them is simply just a political, but not a dogmatic power.
There's no opposition. There's no opposition. These are allies. They work together. In the attacks of October the 7th, I mean, as you said, the Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigade, which is the military wing of Fatah, which is the PLO, which is the Palestinian Authority, combined forces, joined forces with Hamas in the attacks, in the training ahead of time, in the planning ahead of time, and in the attacks themselves. And they themselves have said so publicly. I mean, we're not just attributing this to them. They themselves have announced publicly that they took part in those attacks. There's no opposition. These are combined forces.
So I will get to the policy implication of that for the United States and Israel in a moment, but I wanted to ask a follow-up question. So all these organizations are actually just different versions of the same thing with minor distinctions without
the same thing is tyranny. The same thing is terror. Everything else comes from that.
It then makes complete sense for them to try to dislodge Israel by joining forces and to try to weaken it and cause mayhem and havoc. But here's the long view version of this. It is very obvious that even with all the intelligence failures and all the elements of surprise that was on the side of these organizations, Israel was always going to be a militarily superior power. So what in your opinion did these 5 groups that joined forces, put aside whatever political bickering that they had, like any gangs will have while being, the same nature, and focusing on this task, what were they hoping or thought would happen? Did they think that...
So what I would say to that is that this entire operation, the Shabbat massacre attack against Israel on October the 7th, was planned and organized by the Islamic Republic of Iran. The regime in Tehran organized all of this. We know that from various open sources, to include the Wall Street Journal, which wrote a very revealing report about all the meetings that were held among Hamas leadership, Hezbollah leadership, and Iranian regime leadership in actually not just the weeks, but the months before the October attack. So we know that the Iranian regime organized it and led it and directed this attack. And it was under the aegis of the Islamic Republic of Iran that these various, and yes, you may call them diverse, different groups joined together, but they all share the faithful, devout practice and obedience to Islam. Now, the Shiites and the Sunnis have often, through history, fought one another, happily tear one another to shreds on the battlefield. But you may have heard of the concept, it comes out of the Arabian desert, really, of what's called balanced opposition.
Sure,
and so it begins, I against my brother and I against our cousins, we and our cousins against the other guys, right? And when you expand that out, concentric circles, always balanced, all the way out to the farthest point, you get to Dar al-Islam versus Dar al-Harb. Dar al-Islam means the house of Islam, all of Islam, Sunni, Shiite, and any other. Dar al-Harb means the house of war, all those places on earth that are not yet conquered for Islam and subjugated to Sharia, to Islamic law. And the Dar al-Islam subjugated to Islam, to the Sharia, to the Islamic law. So that is how you can have the Islamic Republic of Iran's regime, a Shiite regime of 12 Shiites, pulling this whole alliance, axis of evil together for those attacks. That's how that can happen.
So my big question here, and that I have not heard a very clear answer yet. There's been a lot of speculation, but not a really clear answer, which is the following. Was Iran hoping that by throwing all these forces at Israel and forcing it into a confrontation with all these groups, it would sufficiently weaken Israel and support for Israel that it would just make its long-term strategic goals easier? Or was all of it simply a distraction from its nuclear ambitions and some other part of its military strategy, which Israel and its growing defense relations in the Middle East were potentially threatening?
You know, it may have been a combination of some of those things. Probably through information operations, in which they all excel. It may have been hoped that when Israel predictably, of course, was going to strike back at Hamas, at Gaza, that world opinion might be shaped against Israel, because war is awful, no matter who fights it, where or when, it's awful. And there are always going to be civilian casualties, even though the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, are the most ethical, moral military forces I think have ever existed on the face of the earth, taking care not to cause civilian casualties, dropping millions of leaflets written in Arabic on Gaza, telling people where to go, how to get out of the way of the fighting, making millions of phone calls to people, individuals in their own apartments. Get out, we're going to bomb the building in 30 minutes. They give them warning. Nobody does that. But despite all of that, information operations organized by, well, some of the leftist Marxist communist parts of the axis of evil here, perhaps it was hoped that that would swing public opinion against Israel, and in particular would sway the Biden administration here in the United States to back off of its initial strong support for Israel and its support for Israel's right to defend itself against horrific human rights atrocities and attack. But that might have been the hope. And then to your second part there about a distraction from the Iranian nuclear weapons program, that might have been part of it as well. Obviously, we know that Iran is developing nuclear weapons, and that the day will come, more than likely, when Israel will have to take anticipatory self-defense measures against that nuclear weapons program. And it could also have been, you know, a part of trying to distract attention from that. Yes.
So we're at a point where even the rather unfriendly BBC news service, which is at one point was literally kicked out of Israel for its disinformation tactics, is reporting that all these organizations are one and the same, working together against Israel, and all were dedicated to a genocidal task.
Yeah.
Nevertheless,
every once in a while, they get something right, huh?
So when it comes from BBC, you can't really argue with that. This is not some Jewish organization where you could say, oh, they're paranoid, they're conspiracy minded. They're, you know, they just hate all Palestinians. But the Biden, despite this evidence that came out of this very, you know, leftist-friendly, credible for that reason service, the Biden administration still is pushing the idea of having the PA take over Gaza in the event Hamas is in fact destroyed, annihilated. Is
Yeah,
it
I've seen
really
that.
extreme level of naivete, or are some elements of the Biden administration perfectly aware that this would be a distinction without a difference, and these groups would be working with the Hamas leadership in Doha
You know,
and
I think that the leadership that we have now at the top of our national security community
Mhm,
and the Biden administration, um, they don't have a very comprehensive. This is my opinion. They don't have a very good understanding of how the Middle East works. They don't know their
mhm,
history. They don't know how the different players interact with one another, how things work. And so the fallback position, as you say, seems to be that they're now tossing about the idea that the Palestinian Authority under Abu Mazen or Mahmoud Abbas um, should come in at the end of the war after Hamas is destroyed. And by the way, it may be that the Shiite Iranian regime is willing to sacrifice Hamas, which it knows is going to be destroyed, but that the PA would come in after all that, and because the Gaza Strip needs some kind of administrative
true.
governance, to uh, run the electricity and the water and fill the potholes if they ever do that. Um, and so they don't know where else to look. They have no much. They don't have any imagination of how else things could work, and so they fall back on the Palestinian Authority, which of course is the PLO, which is Fatah, which is every bit a jihad organization as Hamas ever has been. But they don't know any of these things that we're talking about tonight. They're clueless about all of this. And so yeah, they're bandying about suggesting that the PA would come in and administer governance in the Gaza Strip. After, by the way, having been defeated in the 2006 elections, which actually were held the year after, by the way, that all the Israeli official presence was removed from Gaza in 2005, IDF actually dragging Jewish people out of their homes, out of their synagogues. Do you know they even dug up the Jewish cemeteries and brought the bodies home for reburial? That's how completely Israel left Gaza. There was no occupation after 2005. 2006 were the elections. Hamas won the elections. Next year, 2007, Hamas was very busy throwing Palestinian Authority people off the tops of tall buildings. That's how that ended. And so now they think, the Biden administration and top officials think, Secretary of State Antony Blinken or National Security Council advisor Jake Sullivan, they think that they're going to bring the PA back into Gaza after all that history that people have not forgotten. It's a while ago, but not that long ago. And bring the PA back in, and that's going to be all just hunky-dory for the Gazan people? Probably not. Never mind the fact, of course, that, as I said, the Palestinian Authority is the PLO, is Fatah, are jihadis, just like Hamas, absolutely dedicated 100% to the destruction of the Jewish state of Israel. I don't know what they're thinking.
Needless to say, this whole story, that of this group alliance, has been significantly underplayed. In fact, you would think that there'd be headlines all over the place and endless discussions. Well, how is it that it wasn't just Hamas and or even Palestinian Islamic Jihad, but all these other entities who were involved? Why is no one talking about them? What is their role? How are they facilitating, war crimes against Israel, human rights abuses, massive massacres, and obviously genocidal intent?
Mm-hmm.
Um, how is it that anyone is still giving them any credibility vis-a-vis Hamas after
Very
this very
few, right?
open
Very
and
few.
clear positioning? Previously, there was an effort to portray some of these groups as slightly more quote unquote moderate or less violent or more pragmatic and willing to negotiate. Clearly, this event openly revealed that that is not the case. The danger from West Bank those territories under control of PA is just as great in terms of security as Hamas, and for all we know, something similar may be planning there from that angle when Israel.
Well, look at the terrorism, the Islamic Jihad terrorism coming out of cities in Samaria like Jenin and Nablus and Tulkarm. That is jihad terror. They're already attacking with Islamic jihad terror. How do they think that's going to work if they put those people in charge of Gaza?
By the way, on that note, again, thanks to Wall Street Journal's reporting, we now know that Iran is funneling a lot of weapons into that area, and still there seems to be no outcry about putting a stop to it. There's no surprise that all of a sudden Iran is co-opting that entity also, in addition, the same way as it did Hamas. So there's no discussion about Iran looking to infiltrate and take hold of those territories, no matter who is in charge, whether it's PA or Hamas or somebody else.
Iran is the head of the Hydra, as they say, or the head of the octopus, maybe, of Islamic Jihad in the entire Middle East region, Middle East, North Africa region today. They are the organizers, the armors, the ones who arm them, the funders, the backers, the supporters, and those who train these jihad forces. Now, the reason that I think the Biden administration is reluctant to call out Iran, even as the Iranian-backed Houthis, Ansar Allah is their actual name, are firing drones and missiles all over the region into the Red Sea, aimed at Israel, aimed at some of our United States Navy vessels in the area. Even as that is all going on, attacking commercial shipping, which isn't even Israeli flagged by Bahamas or by Panama or some such. Even as all of that is going on, the Biden administration remains reluctant to call them out. And perhaps the reason is that the Biden administration still holds on to the forlorn hope that they can somehow revive the JCPOA, Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, agreed to back in July of 2015, otherwise known as the Iran nuclear talks, which Iran has made perfectly clear they want no more part of, probably because they already have been building warheads. The only thing that's missing is they haven't attached them yet to the nose cones of their missiles. When that happens, I think the Israelis will know about it. But perhaps because the Biden administration still clings to this forlorn hope that they can revive those talks in Vienna, maybe that's why they don't want to call out the Iranian regime for what it's doing, what it has done, and what it will continue to do until it is stopped.
For what it's worth, I think the obsession with Hamas, as opposed to part of a network, and this obsession with Iran and its nuclear program have sort of blinded everyone involved to far greater realities, which is if Iran controls most of the Middle East, including areas directly adjacent to Israel, it doesn't matter whether they have a nuclear weapon or not. Even if they just have tactical nukes or nuclear ballistic missiles, that's quite sufficient for to complete destruction and start a very deadly confrontation. And who wants an Israel surrounded by a completely Iran-controlled entity?
Israel will not let that happen.
And the other issue is the fact that, you know, whatever we may think of Iran's nuclear program today, it's already closely aligned with two nuclear powers, Russia and China, not to mention Pakistan in the background.
Yeah.
So this network of nuclear powers is already there and been backing this massacre in Hamas the entire time. So focusing excessively on Hamas and whether or not it should be destroyed and where and to what extent seems to kind of it seems to be we're missing the forest for the trees, and
Well, they have to address the proximate enemy, which attacked Israel on October the 7th, together, by the way, with the smaller Shiite jihad organization in Gaza called the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, or sometimes PIJ for short with the initials, that was directly formed by the Iranian regime. Whereas, of course, Hamas, being Sunni, formed out of the Muslim Brotherhood. But they had to focus. The Israelis absolutely have to focus first on that threat, and to make sure that that threat can never again exist in a way that would threaten Israeli people or the Israeli nation. And so that has to be cleared out first. They're perfectly well aware of the threat of Iran as the regional power that unites all of these forces under its aegis. They're perfectly well aware of that. But they have to, the Israelis, the IDF, first have to take care of Hamas and remove it as a threat forever from Gaza, which is, of course, right there on Israel's border.
My point, though, is that is certainly true. The point, though, is Israel facing a cycle of endless fighting because Hamas can recruit new commanders from the 2.5 million people indefinitely?
No, they're going to be destroyed. Israel will utterly and completely destroy Hamas as a fighting force. Now, that said, of course, who are Hamas, right? Hamas are the husbands, fathers, sons, and brothers of the Gazan people. You know, they didn't parachute in from Mars someplace.
Sure.
And so the pool of recruits or of sympathizers, of supporters remains. But as a military force, as the IDF destroys its stockpiles of weapons and ammunition, munitions of all kinds, as well as decapitating Hamas as an Islamic Jihad force by taking out its senior commanders, it will be destroyed. There's no question about that. Israel is united and determined on that. After October the 7th, what else could they do? So Hamas will be gone. What remains in Gaza, and that is a question for the day after, how will it be governed? Who will be the administrators, and so forth? Maybe that's a discussion for another day, and it must be had. But for now, it's in the middle of things, and Hamas and PIJ are going to be destroyed.
While Israel is busy with doing what it really needs to do, in terms of securing its borders and preventing further immediate threats, the Iranian information network is busy doing its job, and as you pointed out, it's been quite successful in galvanizing mobs of leftists and other followers around the world. But they're not the only ones doing that job. Russia, China, their propaganda machinery have been quite helpful in that regard, boosting them on social media, in their own media, through their own networks around the world, which are quite significant as well. We are seeing the Putin meeting with Raisi today and discussing the Israel-Hamas war. Raisi flew to Moscow very openly. Right before that, Putin was moving into UAE and Saudi Arabia. Whatever the outcome of those discussions, the point was he was there. He was openly showing his presence, and he did not get arrested despite having a red notice hanging over his head. He calmly went. He came into UAE with 4 jet fighters, not simply on a private plane as a normally a head of state would. He came in with a military force into the Middle East, and that sends a signal. That sends a signal that Iran has backing, that these powers are expanding their reach into the Middle East, and that while neighboring states may not be fond of Muslim Brotherhood and Iran-inspired organizations, they will also not necessarily take any action on behalf of Israel. Israel is on its
Well,
own.
here's something I think to think about. Um, those nation states of the Middle East, in particular those of the Gulf Cooperation Council, meaning, in and around the Arabian Peninsula, the Persian Gulf, and that would include Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Bahrain, United Arab Emirates, and so forth. They're very well aware that their major enemy and the threat to them and their governments, their countries, comes from Iran.
Mhm.
They are not confused about that. The fact that Vladimir Putin may have been welcomed into a couple of them for brief visits. I guess he probably felt he needed the jet planes to protect him from possible arrest, with the arrest warrant out from the ICC, the International Court at The Hague.
Mhm.
That does not negate
Mhm.
what I think is the enduring influence and power of the Abraham Accords. They are still very much alive and well behind the scenes. Whatever the drama out on the stage for the people to see might be, behind the scenes, at least the original, I would say the three. I would say that the original members of the
Mhm.
Abraham Accords, meaning the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, and Morocco. I'm going to leave Sudan out of it for a moment because they've got problems of their own right
Right.
now. But behind the three, at least, and Israel, or it never would have happened in the first place, is Saudi Arabia, and they're very astute, young Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, or MBS as he's called. They know perfectly well what the score is in the Middle East. But there is this thing called the strong horse, weak horse.
Mhm.
And so it matters a lot that Israel be supported and backed and armed and funded enough and quickly enough to defend itself against Hamas and PIJ, to obliterate those threats from the Gaza Strip, and that be completed in as quick a period of time as possible, which then will leave Israel very prominently as the strong horse in the region. And I expect that's what's going to happen, despite the scurrying about of head of state visits and all of that. I think that Israel will emerge as the strong horse. I think that it will succeed in its military operations in Gaza, and it will be seen as the victor, not just against Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad, but against Iranian proxy Islamic terror forces, because that's what they are. Everybody will understand that an Iranian originated plot to attack and kill and mutilate Israelis has failed. The attack was horrific. The atrocities took place, but they did not destroy the Jewish state of Israel or the spirit of the Israelis, who have come together in a remarkable way to support the IDF and the forces fighting in Gaza. So I think the outcome matters a lot and how it finishes, but don't think that kabuki dance, head of state visits signify a whole lot. Yes, there is an axis of evil, if you will, among China, Iran, and Russia. Yes, there is. But at the moment, the Iranian proxies are getting their clocks cleaned.
US still has a vital role to play in the Middle East. It is an indispensable partner to the Abraham Accords. It is a guarantor of security. It did send very strong deterrent signals by moving its warships into the area, and has been very openly backing Israel and openly seeking the annihilation of Hamas. There's no question about it. It has also kept UAE from entering into defense deals with Russia, much to their chagrin. But at the same time, there is a bit of a mixed signal going on. There's a mixed signal due to internal polarization in the US, with the funding issue being unresolved, including emergency aid to Israel still not being decided upon. There is a factionalism inside the Biden administration, with leaks on the one hand and different messages over different things coming out, despite the seeming dedication to support Israel in some form, and this whole issue with Iran. What will it take for the US to redesignate Houthis as terrorists, to end this efforts to appease Iran in any sense of the word?
Well,
When will
I,
a single-minded strategy be developed finally?
I think that what will tip the scales in the direction you're suggesting is public pressure. And so part of that are broadcasts like this one. So thank you very much for tackling this subject. But it's not the Biden administration or even the Democrat Party in the United States. They're kind of a mess. They're a hot mess. Yes, there are divisions among them. They can't get their policy straight. They don't really know what they're doing. But public pressure gets the attention of politicians who will be running again for re-election next year in 2024. And that's, I think, what has to tip the scales. That's what has to get the attention of the administration, of the Democrat Party, to not give up on what looked to begin, as you said, started out as, complete and full backing, at least kind of visibly so, for Israel, not to back off of that, because they will, if they seem to be going in that direction, they will face opposition from a large number among the American electorate, which supports Israel very strongly.
Finally, this information issue of information warfare and what role it will play in the continuing, I would say, new Cold War confrontation, whatever you want to call it, between US, Israel, and their allies on the one hand, and Iran network access of evil and assorted proxies on the other hand. Which is, the fact is, while US is overwhelmingly pro-Israel and against authoritarianism and security threats of those sorts, those countries have been running very effective information campaigns. They've been co-opting entire institutions. They've been exercising soft power for decades, and US is only starting to wake up to that fact. We have an entire generation of young Middle East studies graduates and professionals who've been brainwashed, who've been completely indoctrinated. We have, in 20 years that may change. Maybe the funding to the educational systems will be reviewed. Maybe reforms will be finally instituted. But meanwhile, the young people coming in now and running for elections now and entering the professional spheres in the media and elsewhere, now they do not have the skills, the background, and the ideology to fight against these threats,
or even to enter the workforce, right? Even to enter the workforce in a meaningful way. So I don't know if you're familiar with a book. It's called The Naked Communist. It was written by a former FBI agent named W. Cleon Skousen, published in 1958. And the important chapter in that book is chapter 13. That chapter's title is The 45 Goals of Communism Today. And Skousen, the author, put those 45 goals together, taken from the testimony in front of Congress, both the House and the Senate, back in the earlier 1950s, the testimony of communists and former communists who were brought before those committees for testimony. And among those goals, we won't go through all 45 because we only have a few minutes left, but among the 45, one in particular stands out for me and it's number 17. And it says, get control of the schools, get control of the curriculum and of the teachers' associations, teachers' unions. And I think that if we look back at communist Marxist, not just ideology, but also the methodology for how to destroy a Western civilization like ours from within, we can look to the Italian communist Antonio Gramsci, who of course died in an Italian prison, but wrote a whole bunch of notebooks while he was there, from which we get the idea of the long march through the institutions, a term itself actually coined by a German communist in the 1960s by the name of Rudi Dutschke. And that methodology of taking over the institutions of a society from within is, I think, what happened here in the United States, in Europe as well. But the number one goal, back to the goal number 17 of the 45 goals, was the young people. That was number one. Yes, all the other institutions like entertainment and Wall Street, and the media, of course, anything else you want to name, but to get into the educational system of our academia, I think was their top number one goal, even though it's number 17 in the list. And so you had coming out of that the Frankfurt School, which was a projection of the Comintern, the Communist International, formed after the 1917 Russian Revolution, which first tried to export communism to Germany, but because of the rise of the Nazis and Hitler in the 1920s and 30s, they didn't succeed in Germany. Actually, they got kicked out of Germany for the most part, and brought it here. They brought it here. The Comintern found a foothold. Their first one in the United States was at Columbia University, in the leftist faculty lounges of Columbia University in New York. And it spread from there throughout academia, other universities, and on down even to the high school level. So today, what do we see? Last week, during this past week, just passed, we saw 3 presidents of top Ivy League schools, didn't we? Sitting in front of Congress. They were the presidents of the University of Pennsylvania, of MIT, and of Harvard. And every one of them was asked the question very directly: is a call for the genocide of the Jewish people against the code of behavior for your university? And not one of those 3 women would answer that question directly. They refused to say that calling for the genocide, the killing of all Jews, not just in Israel, but on campuses too, refused to say that that violated their code of conduct for their university. The whole country saw that clip, that part of that hearing, and more of it too, really, on their TVs, on our TV programs. And they were disgusted and appalled and horrified, and especially families with young people as students, maybe in those universities, maybe in others. And they're realizing, uh-oh, we have a serious problem. And you'll see the reaction. I know we're up against the clock here, but we're seeing the reaction where I think it really matters. And that is back to the money, the big donors, especially Jewish donors. Why didn't they think of this? Who had donated so generously in the millions and hundreds of millions of dollars to these institutions over the years. Americans, I'm saying here now, have pulled back and withdrawn endowment donations. But the other,
given how much more funding they're getting from Arab states and
well, that was what I was going to say next. Yeah, that has not stopped. The donations from countries like Qatar, for example, which endow these universities, the chairs, the professors, the departments of Middle East studies, with huge amounts of money. And then, of course, the students come over from those places, which are jihadi terrorist hotbeds. They come over and they pay full tuition, which these schools value very much. They don't have to offer, financial aid. They don't have to offer scholarships. They just pay the full price, and that's great. So all of those influences are still very much at these universities, even as the American public and the donor class, if you will, are turning away. So that's the next thing to tackle, I guess.
But where does it leave us now with the immediate byproduct of this malicious activity for decades, with these young people and active people who are already on the ground? That leaves us at a huge disadvantage compared to our adversaries, whose institutions are very much controlled and whose students are very much, by and large, of course, there are exceptions, in the mindset they want them to be, whereas we are in exactly the opposite
Well, the
situation.
universities themselves, responding to public pressure and the loss of donors, are themselves going to have to, number one, fire those Jew-hating professors, Jew-hating department chairs, and Jew-hating presidents, number one. And number two, the universities are going to have to implement policies that allow for the expulsion, the revoking of any F1 student visas of foreign students who participate on campus in contributing to a threatening atmosphere against Jewish students, who participate in protests and demonstrations that call for not only the support of Hamas, a terror jihad organization, but the annihilation of the Jewish people. Revoke those F1 visas and revoke their student standing at the universities and send them packing back home again. I think that's what has to be done. So I guess we can end on that note, maybe, huh?
I certainly hope that this will be sufficient, and I hope these universities will be motivated, and even if it means losing a large amount of money which these foreigners bring in because they have to pay upfront in cash. But I am still concerned about the vulnerability we have about these people having already been brainwashed, and what do we do about those? But I guess we have to fight with what we have because that's all there is.
Well, yeah, that is a concern, absolutely a concern. And the law firms, for example, or other media maybe, that might have hired them upon graduation, we see some of them too saying, no, not those students, we're not hiring them. That's what has to happen too.
That at least would be a very good start indeed, and I hope more people wake up to the fact that this is a threat to them reputationally, and quite frankly could end in a terrorist attack down the road with some of them. So I hope at least these corporations, law firms, and businesses exercise common sense, if not ethics. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Irina, for having me.
We'll be back again next week, Tuesday night at 9 p.m. as always, and we'll be tackling this issue, continuing to review the Israel-Hamas situation and the entire Middle East scenario. In the future, we'll also be looking we'll also be taking a closer look at the issue that came up today, which is why do many Muslims oppose some of these hardline fundamentalist, politically motivated views? Why do they choose to interpret things differently, and what are the sources for different views on Islam? We'll be looking at that in future programs. Stay tuned. Thank you so much again.